Okay, welcome all of you who have tuned in for our webinar this evening, Spooky Lakes, Strange and Mysterious Lakes That Dot Our Planet. We want to welcome Geo Rutherford. Thank you for joining us tonight. I will go through a few housekeeping items and then we will get right to all the good stuff. So, as you may have heard, this meeting is being recorded. This will be made available on our website and our YouTube channel. So, anyone who's looking to share this with friends, that's where you can find it. We do ask that you stay muted and you keep your cameras off for the duration of the webinar. It just helps with background noise and in case there's any issues with um, bandwidth, so we don't have any problems with our cameras as well. We can have you put your questions in the chat box. If you're familiar with Zoom, you may find the chat box is either at the bottom or the top of your screen. You can type those in there and we'll share those questions with Geo at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, we do send you out a very quick feedback questionnaire. If you can fill that out, give us some feedback, let us know what you thought. We can share that with Geo. And if you have any ideas for upcoming webinars, we love to hear that. Quick little info about New Hampshire Lakes. If you're not familiar with us, we're a nonprofit organization that's the voice for all of New Hampshire's 1,000 lakes. Our mission is to restore and preserve the health of New Hampshire's lakes. And we do that through our programs, advocacy, conservation, and outreach. Our advocacy program is in full swing right now in the legislative session at the State House. Our conservation programs are the Lake Host program, teaching boaters to clean, drain, and dry their boats to protect our lakes from aquatic invasive species, and our Lake Smart program, helping communities throughout the state of New Hampshire live in a lake-friendly way, helping protect our lakes, and our outreach program, spreading awareness and bringing you fun things like we have going on tonight. It's easy to become a supporter. Just go to nhlakes.org/donate and you can help keep this important work going if you love our lakes as much as we do. We're your hosts this evening. I'm Erin Mastine, our Outreach Manager, and Kat Kelleher, our Conservation Program Coordinator. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat box for you. And without further ado, our expert presenter this evening, Geo Rutherford, the author of Spooky Lakes, Strange and Mysterious Lakes That Dot Our Planet. I will stop sharing my screen so that we can start hearing about the more fun stuff. And go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. I'll actually share my screen here. So let me know if you can't see that.
That looks great.
Okay. Just going to move this stuff over here. I teach at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and so I'm used to teaching on Zoom and like moving everything out of the way properly. So anyway, I think it's ironic to start by saying I'm an expert presenter. I do find myself a good, steward of lakes and lake conversations and lake education, but I actually didn't know anything really about lakes prior to moving from Ann Arbor, Michigan to Milwaukee. So I just want to give you guys a little bit of a backstory before I just dive in, get it, to the lakes of our world. And it is relevant because this move is the reason I ended up on the path that I'm doing today. And I think you guys might find it interesting if you are dealing with things like invasive species, water pollution, toxic algae. All of those things are what started my interest in the lakes. So I moved here to Milwaukee. If you've never heard of Milwaukee, me neither. I had never thought about Milwaukee. But I moved there because I wanted to get my master's in fine arts, which is a terminal degree. It's kind of like the PhD of art. It's a 3-year program, and I was getting it in printmaking. When I was doing that, I decided that I wanted to I wanted to focus on the Great Lakes because I was conveniently only a few blocks away from Lake Michigan. I'd never lived that close to the Great Lakes, and all of my artwork through my whole history of undergrad and even in high school was about climate issues and issues involving water. I've always done water stuff. So I couldn't help myself. I moved here and I decided to go to this beach every day for 90 days. It's called Bradford Beach in Milwaukee. And while I was there, I just collected things. I didn't really know what I was doing yet. This was kind of like a ritual to figure out what I wanted to do. if you're an artist and you've ever had artist block, or you're a writer and you've had writer block or any type of creative blockage, the best way to fix that is just to go do something and just participate in a ritual, at least for me. So I went every day to Bradford Beach and I collected plastic and found materials. Um, I kind of skipped over this briefly, but this guy here, whoops, going back really quick. This is Dan Egan, and he wrote this book called The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. It is truly the most important book you could read about what's going on with our Great Lakes, and that affects everybody who's in the watershed and beyond. And it's a story that's affecting lakes around the world. It's not only a Great Lakes problem. It just so happens that the Great Lakes represent 20% of our unfrozen freshwater, and we're lucky enough to be right here in the United States and Canada with those Great Lakes as a resource. So recognizing the importance of that in our future, where everything is getting much hotter and everything is changing, the Great Lakes are a resource. So while I was going to the beaches, I would collect material. And at first I didn't know what I was going to do with this. I was just collecting stuff. Conveniently, Bradford Beach is a really filthy beach, which was very exciting for me because I was collecting both natural and unnatural material. But I ended up making an artist book from this collection. And if you have ever seen my TikTok account, you may have seen this book. It was my first viral video on TikTok, because the way you go viral on TikTok is to make everybody a little mad. And I made everybody a little mad because this is questionably a book. I think most people who have encountered a book would assume that it has to have covers, it has to have a spine, it has to have pages. But if you kind of think about a book as opening and revealing and telling a story, then these books do that by telling you a story of what's going on with the beach. And so this was kind of my master's thesis. It was kind of my magnus opus as well. I did some other work, but this piece was something I did for Bradford Beach in Lake Michigan. But then I also traveled all the Great Lakes to collect at all of the shores so that I could figure out what was going on across all of these different locations. And it was interesting at how different they were. But I was still a printmaker, so I made prints like this Manet Noir lithograph, and I did a lot of collage work. But because of what was going on in the world at the time, I also started a TikTok account in the pandemic, like everybody else. Everybody had like a different pandemic identity, but my identity was making videos about artist books and art and my work about the Great Lakes. But then I also kind of accidentally started making videos about lakes in general. It started from a TikTok about the Great Lakes and then just kind of ended up getting out of control. And I just started to do videos about all things wet. Now, I don't have a background in science myself. My mother is a PhD in geology, and I was a science kid. I took all the science classes. I loved science. I thought I was going to be a science teacher, but I chickened out because of chemistry and physics, which is unfortunate, I think, in retrospect, because I think I would have made a great science teacher. But instead, I taught high school ceramics and jewelry for 5 years, and then went to graduate school. So this, uh, lake account, this TikTok account that would kind of gain traction during the pandemic, the most popular thing that kind of came from it was something called Spooky Lake Month. I started it in October of 2020, right in the middle of everything. And it was pretty messy that first year, but by the second year, I really honed my video making skills and I got better at it. And I had a better idea of what I wanted from making those TikToks. So I started to make Spooky Lake Month videos. And Spooky Lake Month in general is a little bit tricky because it's not what you might expect. The first year I did it, I was really sticking to lakes, but it slowly evolved to anything wet could qualify as a spooky lake topic. Haunted hydrology. It's 31 days of haunted hydrology. Now, the other tricky thing with this is that it's not really about the supernatural. So there's a lot of misnomers in there. Calling it spooky and calling it haunted is not really accurate, because what I'm interested in is the natural world being weird and strange all by herself. I'm interested in the way that we interact with the natural world by having shipwrecks or toxic disasters such as the Techa River, or just strange spaces like spent fuel pools, weirdly enough, qualifies for Spooky Lake Month. One of my favorite topics of all time was the Alaskan mud flats, where you can get trapped in the mud and the tide comes in and can drown you. So as you can kind of tell from this, it's anything that is not supernatural or conspiracy theories or true crime. It's a lot of it has an interesting uh setting, at least from my perspective. So I thought I'd show you one just for fun so that we can go into understanding spooky lakes a little bit from this perspective. So I'm going to show you a classic Lake Baikal one. We're not going to watch the whole thing. We'll just watch a little bit of it because I'm pretty sure it's a little long, but it'll be relevant later. So, oop, do I have to do anything or is this just going to play okay for everybody? I think we're okay. I never asked permission to put this video into this slideshow. So,
It looked like it was about to play fine, so.
okay. All right. Hopefully everybody can hear it.
We can't hear it.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no
That's
sound.
okay. No worries.
The image is cool.
Well, we'll move on. I wasn't 100% sure if it would work or not. I should have double checked about the settings before putting a video in, but you can find my videos on my TikTok account and you can find them on Instagram. So whatever. But Spooky Lake Month, the important thing is that Spooky Lake Month was the reason I got a book deal. And this is where the PowerPoint, I'm gonna kind of focus on the Spooky Lakes book because it became this kind of doctrine for what I consider the strangest lakes on the planet, which is really why you guys are here tonight. Now, I left a few images on this slideshow of the process of making the Spooky Lakes book, which technically wasn't in the description for this presentation, but I find that kind of thing interesting and they were already in here, so I just decided to leave them. So part of this is talking about the lakes that made the cut for Spooky Lakes and why they made the cut. But then also you get to see a little bit of the behind the scenes of what it took to illustrate and write this book. So I wrote the book and I illustrated it. So I think that's kind of an interesting perspective. So Spooky Lakes technically narrowed down to 25 strange and mysterious lakes, even though there are a few other lakes that kind of secretly make it into the book as well. The book starts with lake facts, and some of these lake facts are kind of fun. So I thought I should tell you guys some fun lake facts of the world because sometimes people don't know, right? So the first thing I think is most important is that, a lake is a body of water surrounded by land, but sometimes that definition is challenged, or the name of a lake is not relevant necessarily to its modern definition. So, for example, the Dead Sea is a lake, the Caspian Sea is a lake, the Salton Sea is a lake. And then there's other times where lakes are not really lakes. Like Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana is technically an estuary or a bay. And Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela is technically a bay and not a lake. So there's the modern definition kind of fighting against the way that people interpreted those bodies of water when they encountered them potentially thousands of years ago, or even more than that. So the study of lakes is limnology. They also study streams, wetlands, groundwater. It's kind of, or any type of inland bodies of water. There's around 300 million lakes, 304 million lakes on Earth. Now that's questionable because you never know what the difference between a lake and a pond is, but just so you can tell your friend next time that they ask, there is no technical difference. It's just that a lake is usually determined as being larger than a pond, but there's no official statistics of how that needs to kind of be determined. And there's many places that are called ponds that are not ponds. They're probably lakes or the other way around. So it can be kind of interesting. So most of the lakes in the world are in the northern hemisphere, which is like the top half of our world. And that's because of glaciers, because most of the lakes in the world were created by glaciers. And the fun lakes of the world were created by tectonic plates. We'll get there. So I feel like that's kind of an interesting thing. A fun fact, the picture in the background here is Lake Repba, which is in Senegal, which is a pink lake. It literally is bubblegum pink. You can Google it. And they collect salt from this lake. And so you can see these piles of salt here in the foreground. So this is what I meant when I said I was going to show you guys a little bit of the behind the scenes. So of course, because as a Great Lakes girly, I had to start with Lake Superior, which in my mind is one of the spookiest lakes in the world. And this is what it looked like to try to paint Lake Superior. So, oops, and there's a picture of my cat. I can't remember why I put that in there, but there she is, my cat Minnie. Here we go. So Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. And unlike a lot of lakes in this world that are just as large, the Great Lakes have a history of transportation that we don't see in quite the same way in the African Great Lakes or in Lake Baikal or in Lake Titicaca or one of these other enormous lakes on the planet. We see that a little bit with the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, but not as much outside of the Great Lakes. So the Great Lakes have this special history of being traversed by giant ships, and there's over 10,000 shipwrecks in the Great Lakes, and some of which we've never been able to find. There's tons of wrecks, and even one particular airplane in Lake Michigan that we have never been able to find because they're so massive. Lake Superior gets waves that are over 30 feet high, and it's around 500 feet deep on average, but it's over 1,300 feet deep at its deepest point. And something to appreciate when you start thinking about lakes of the world is, their depth kind of ends up being an interesting factor of why they're strange or spooky. So this painting here is kind of an ode to the most famous shipwreck of Lake Superior, which is the Edmund Fitzgerald, which went down in 1975. But that wasn't actually the one that I decided to focus on for Spooky Lakes. So Lake Superior was the only lake that got 3-page spreads in the book. And that's because I decided to tell the story of the Kamloops shipwreck, which occurred also in the early kind of 1927. And it was traveling between Lake Huron and Lake Superior, and it hit a terrible storm, like many of them do in November, when the water of the lake is much warmer than the air around it. So you end up with this intense weather patterns that occur because of that difference in heat and temperature, and so on and so forth. So the Kamloops shipwreck went down, and a bunch of the crew members ended up stranded on Isle Royale, or Isle Royal, depending on who you want to fight with. And they ended up on the shore there and did not survive and froze. There's a note in the book about one of the stewardesses. The note is a little debated about its authenticity, but years after the Kamloops disappeared, a message in the bottle was found almost 150 miles away from Isle Royale. And it was penned by Alice Bettridge, who was a young stewardess. And she wrote, "I'm the last one alive, freezing and starving to death on Isle Royale. I just want my mom and dad to know my fate." So they didn't actually find Whoops, did I not include the picture of the shipwreck? I must have forgot to add it in there. They didn't find the Kamloops shipwreck until 1975, but something that was kind of interesting and an effect that occurs in Lake Superior specifically, but also any cold freshwater lake, is that human bodies can be really well preserved in those types of environments. Environments where it's too cold for bacteria and minerals in the freshwater interact with our skin and cause a process called saponification, which creates a substance on the surface of the skin called adipocere. And this kind of makes you into essentially a soap mummy. This can also happen in graveyards that are flooded or are moist, anoxic environments where there's no bacteria. And as a result, the bodies don't decompose quite normally, and instead they kind of live on in perpetuity, encased in this soapy mummy. I illustrated this in a little, maybe not as if you don't listen, don't Google it, okay? Just do yourself a favor and don't Google adipocere, and just let my spooky image here suffice, because it is a very gross process that occurs. So this waxy kind of substance makes a body that can survive in Lake Superior for over 100 years. So this friend here, his name is Old Whitey, and it's a body that floats around in the boiler room of the Kamloops shipwreck to this day. And when divers visit, and if they are experienced enough to do something like go into the labyrinth of a shipwreck into the boiler room, then his corpse will follow you around the room because of the water currents of your fins as you're swimming. So he's kind of an iconic figure of the Great Lakes, and he's an iconic figure of the science that occurs when human bodies end up at the bottom of a cold freshwater lake. And I really think he's amazing. So yeah. I had to throw this one in the front of the video or the front of this presentation, even though I did leave it to the last lake in the book because it felt like it's kind of my magnus opus of lakes, and in my mind, the most important lake in the world or most interesting lake. No offense to Lake Superior, I love you, but nothing kind of comes close to Lake Baikal. So if you're not familiar, Lake Baikal is the oldest and the deepest lake in the world. So I said that Lake Superior was 1,300 feet deep at its deepest point. Lake Baikal is over a mile deep at the deepest point. So it's over 5,000, or it's 5,387 feet at its deepest point. That's kind of crazy. That's kind of wild. So it's also the oldest lake, so it's 25 million years old. The oldest lakes in the planet, almost all of them, are tectonic lakes, which means that they exist because two plates are either pulling apart or doing something else weird, like pushing in, and like even the Dead Sea is because of that. So at the location of Lake Baikal, which is in Siberia, there's two tectonic plates that are ripping apart. And so the lake is getting just deeper and deeper and deeper. Fun fact about that process for Lake Baikal specifically is there's over 300 rivers that flow into Lake Baikal. So you would expect that all of the sediment being carried from those rivers into Lake Baikal would have eventually filled it in, because that's how almost all lakes in the world eventually die, is that they're just filled in with sediment and they dry up. So Lake Baikal, why hasn't it dried up, or why hasn't it filled in with sediment? And that's because it continues to rip apart along that rift zone. And so technically there's another more than a mile of sediment at the very bottom of Lake Baikal that's been compacted into this crevice in the earth. So that's kind of fun little fact. 80% of all the life forms in Lake Baikal are endemic to Lake Baikal. They do not exist anywhere else on Earth. And partly the result of this strange environment that's super deep and super fresh. And it has these percolating, like deep sea vents that we usually see in the ocean. So deep sea is not really applicable, but like deep lake vents where minerals and water kind of come up from deep below the earth into the lake, kind of creating this really unique environment and circulating the water in this incredibly deep lake, which is another thing that doesn't always happen with lakes. A lot of times lakes, only the surface will circulate and then nothing else will, like the Dead Sea or the Black Sea, which I know is not a lake, but it's the best example of a huge body of water. It should circulate because there's all this wind traveling over it, but instead it never circulates. And there's just this giant anoxic layer at the bottom of it that preserves shipwrecks really well, and nothing can live in it. But luckily, Lake Baikal circulates really well. And there's also all these strange creatures that contribute to this really dense ecosystem. There's the Baikal sponge, which is important for filtration and just keeping the water super clear and clean. There are these strange amphipods. There's a great fish down here, this little guy, called a gullum, which is this is my favorite thing to say ever. And the gullum is a deep sea fish, or in this case, a deep lake fish. So it exists very deep in the lake, hundreds of feet below the surface, where the pressure is really great. And there's like, great Russian legends of bringing this fish to the surface and having it melt in your hand like oil because it's not used to being in the sun. Of course, my favorite, or one of the most popular, we'll come back to that, is the Baikal Nerpa seal, this little guy right here. This seal is only here in Lake Baikal. It's evolved to live in Lake Baikal, and it's different than any other species found on Earth, to the point that we don't even know its ancestors. So there are other freshwater seals on Earth. There's freshwater seals in Finland and Alaska, and even in, I think, in Nova Scotia. But those are seals that potentially got cut off from their saltwater ancestors recently, in the last thousands of years, potentially during the Ice Age. But the Nerpa seals in Lake Baikal were cut off from their saltwater ancestors 2.5 million years ago. So it's kind of a bit of a different story when it comes to that. And that's what makes them special. And scientists have no idea how that happened. Because if you look at Lake Baikal on a map, it's right in the middle of Lake of Siberia, not Lake Superior, right in the middle of Siberia. And so it's like, where did they come from? Did they come from the Arctic? Did they come from the Pacific? Did they come from the Caspian Sea, where there's also seals? Not freshwater, though, because the Caspian Sea is very salty for the most part. So it's kind of interesting. My second page for Lake Baikal, I focused on two things. I have a little bit of stuff about the seals, but then also about this amazing this amazing railroad accident that occurred. And actually, while I was researching for this presentation, I decided to pull up my reference image. So this is the drawing I did, and it's based off of this propaganda image from 1904. It's a Japanese woodblock print. And I've been researching this for a long time, you guys. And this print is actually for sale for the first time. And I'm like, oh my God, I might have to buy it. I mean, it's $1,200, but it might have to be the best investment I ever make into an original piece of art. Okay, but what's the point of this? Okay, so this is the painting, and you can see I gave credit here to that artwork because it's that iconic. But what does this mean? What is this? What are you talking about, Geo? What does this have to do with Lake Baikal? Well, in 1904, there was a conflict between Russia and Japan. And so Russia was speedily trying to build this railroad, this Trans-Siberian Railroad across Russia through around Lake Baikal and then out to the Pacific Ocean towards Japan, so that they could get like people and weapons and everything over to the coast. And the problem was that they hadn't finished building this railroad yet. So in the winter of 1904 or 1905, they decided they were just going to build the railroad across Lake Baikal. And listen, sure, you live in Minnesota, you guys live in New Hampshire. I don't know how much your lakes freeze, but it might be kind of normal to drive on a lake in Minnesota or here in Wisconsin. I live on a lake and people drive on it all the time. But Lake Baikal is the size of Belgium. Doesn't look like it because it's skinny and doesn't look like Lake Michigan or Lake Superior, but it's kind of a crazy thing to build a railroad across a lake that big. I actually think I said here how far it was. It's 40 miles across, a temporary railway that was built on the frozen surface. Of course, this went pretty well, but not great, and they lost a couple. They lost different giant, what are those things called? The big things that they carry with the locomotives, but they also lost a locomotive. So there's an interesting story of losing all of this material straight into the bottom of Lake Baikal because the tracks ended up cracking. So it's kind of a fun story. Anyway, here's the depth of Lake Baikal compared to the depth of Lake Superior and Lake Huron, Lake Ontario. Here's a picture of Lake Baikal if you've never seen one. This is a picture of it. I love this picture. This is all covered completely in fog. So I just wanted to go through a couple other lakes of the world that are just weird and strange, and that's how they qualified for my book. One of them is Pitch Lake. Is it weird that I'm showing you guys the really messy sketches? I just think it's fun. I like seeing process. It's an artist thing, I think. So here you can see Pitch Lake is in Trinidad. And you're like, Geo, it's a lake. What do you mean? How can this possibly be a lake? It looks like it's a lake of asphalt. And you're right. It's a lake of asphalt. But it is pretty lake-like. This is a picture of it. There's a lot of water on it. But it's actually this asphalt pit. Not to be confused with tar, which is weirdly a specific thing. I don't know. Don't get me started. Like the La Brea tar pits, in Los Angeles are not really tar. They're also asphalt, natural asphalt. Also, I'm Canadian, so that's why I say asphalt and not asphalt. So you can kind of see here, this is kind of a picture of what the asphalt looks like on a hot day. It kind of turns gooey and the surface can be really wet and sticky, but people can still swim in it and visit it. It's very cool. It's a natural asphalt seep. So there's constantly new asphalt coming from deep beneath the earth. It's a very cool and strange lake, but you could ask yourself, like, is this really a lake if it's a lake full of asphalt? It's kind of fun. Another lake example that's kind of fun, or a strange lake of our planet, is Lake Nicaragua. which this one's satisfying because like look how similar those two images are. Like I did a good job of doing exactly what I said I was going to do. But Lake Nicaragua is here in Nicaragua. And it's a huge lake considering the size of the actual country of Nicaragua. It's like this enormous lake. But the sharks in this lake, this freshwater lake, has bull sharks who traveled up the San Juan River. You're like, why didn't they go this way? I don't know. I think this is steep. Instead, they traveled all the way up the San Juan River and they just hang out in Lake Nicaragua, just chilling. Just decided to like spend their summers there and then they go home. Sorry, I thought I put myself on do not disturb. So then we've got Jellyfish Lake, another one of my favorites as far as strange lakes on the planet. This one, as you can see, is a little, this is oh shoot, where did it go? Where's the second one? Did I move it? I don't know where it went. That's so weird. Maybe I deleted it oh, it's right here. I don't know why it's hanging out so low. My apologies. That's a weird. Okay, here we go. Everything's fine. Oh, I always do that for my students by accident instead of like properly sharing it. Oh, shoot. How do I do this? I don't know what I'm doing. Slideshow. Okay. I'm so sorry. I'm 35 and not great at everything. So Jellyfish Lake is in Palau, which is in Oceania, as far as like in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And it's kind of a fun lake because it got cut off from the oceans. Like the oceans kind of cut it off during our last ice age with the rising sea level after all of the ice melted. And you can kind of see here in this picture, all these little specks here, these are all jellyfish. So the lake is completely full of freshwater jellies. The lake is like a little salty, but they are a special type of jellyfish. They only live in Jellyfish Lake, and they get all of their food from the little teeny weeny algae that live inside of them and get sunlight. So the jellyfish are moving across the surface of the lake and they follow the sun during the day, and it's kind of this beautiful daily migration to collect their sunlight that they need to feed their little algae that they have inside of them. So that's kind of a fun one. I included a picture, or no, I guess I didn't. Maybe it'll pop up later. I thought I included a picture of what those jellyfish look like when humans are swimming with them. Lake Candy is a fun one. It's in Kazakhstan, and it's the result of a landslide that blocked off a river and resulted in this valley being flooded with water. And when that happens, trees in this it was a mountainous environment, this cold water ended up getting like frozen in time, essentially. So they never properly disintegrated or like got, chewed up by like bacteria or by decomposition because the water is so cold. And so here you can see the trees are perfectly preserved at the bottom of the lake. Let's hope my slides are in order this time. But yeah, here you go. You can see what it looks like. And I think I included a picture of what those trees look like underwater. So it's kind of spooky. This is one of my personal favorite lakes. This is Cali Crater Lake. There's only so many lakes on this planet that were created from an asteroid impact. And my favorite one is Cali Crater Lake because it's the only giant asteroid that hit Earth and humans witnessed it that we know of, right? So it came in around 1500 BCE. These are kind of guesses. It was thousands of years ago. On the Baltic country of Estonia, and it's on an island called Saaremaa, which is right next to Estonia in the Baltic Sea. And Cali Crater Lake was one of 9 craters, so 9 of these large rocks kind of hit the surface, and Cali Crater Lake is the largest one that results from it. What was kind of interesting about it is that because this happened and humans witnessed it and it was very destructive, it has kind of a mythical presence in history where people seem to have spent time around it in kind of in pagan ritualistic ways where they were kind of visiting this space because it's perfectly circular, it's pretty strange looking, and so it kind of for a long time in history it was worshipped or spent time around. They built a wall around it, and we find artifacts in the water like jewelry and bracelets and bones. So like, did they, it's kind of, there's a lot of questions associated with it. There's not a lot of answers, but like, did they make sacrifices here? Was it something that was really important to a specific time of year, and so on and so forth? Also, they think that it's connected to the Greek story of I'm going to say the name wrong, Phaeton, which is like the sun goddess or god, because it was around the same time that Greeks would have seen this kind of blazing through the sky. And here's a picture of it. It is very spooky, right? I love it. It's so great. Oh, see, I told you the jellyfish were going to show up later. Here they are. And then I just must have moved stuff around. Another one of I really enjoy this one. I think it's a really fun one. It just kind of goes to show the variety of lakes on our planet is Lake Shagan or Shagan. Not sure how to pronounce it, which was created when the Russians were experimenting with nuclear bombs in what is today Kazakhstan, used to be the USSR. And so this lake was created from a nuclear explosion, which is so exciting. And it was the largest underground test that they did. It was called the Polygon. Or that's not what it's called. The test was called the Shagan test, but the area that they tested in was called the Polygon, which is also known as Semipalatinsk. And this is similar to what they did in the United States, which is the Project Plowshare, which happened during the Cold War. So we were doing it like in Arizona, and Russia and the USSR, same thing. We're doing it in modern day Kazakhstan in the Polygon. So it's kind of fun because now there's this piece of evidence from that time period, this lake that's still to this day radioactive as a result of doing this nuclear test. So it's kind of a fun one. Lake Natron is one of my favorite lakes to talk about. If you go on the internet and you look up Lake Natron, there's going to be all these clickbait YouTube videos. It's like the lake that will kill you, the most deadly lake on Earth. And I think that's kind of blown out of proportion because you could walk into Lake Natron and it's not going to kill you. However, if you died in Lake Natron, that's another question. If you died in Lake Natron, then your body would be preserved as if you were a mummy in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, they used the salt called natron, which they recovered from the edges of the Nile River. They would use that to dry out a corpse so that it could be maintained in perpetuity. And the same thing happens in Lake Natron. And the only animals that really love Lake Natron, the only animals that really thrive in Lake Natron are the brine shrimp, which love this salty natron salt, and the flamingos that eat them. So if you didn't know, flamingos are pink because they eat pink shrimp, and they eat a lot of them. That's like what they eat. So it's kind of a wonderful, loving relationship between those two things. The one thing I regret with this page spread is that I didn't include a picture of the lake. It was like one of those things where I already had all this stuff painted and it didn't fit. But Lake Natron looks incredible. It's like one of the most amazing looking lakes on the planet. It's very spooky. It's awesome. And so, yeah, I'd say that this is like legitimately one of the most spooky lakes. Oh, also, this was my original layout for Lake Natron before I made the book. This was like my mock-up for it. So I don't remember why I put this in here, but you can kind of see how, if you ever are interested in books, it's kind of fun to see where you start and where you end up. Another one of my favorite, of course, it always comes back to the USSR. It feels like they just do all sorts of weird stuff, and it results in a lot of really weird waters and weird lakes. So Lake Karachay is one of the most, for a long time, it was the most radioactive place on Earth, more radioactive than Chernobyl, more radioactive than Fukushima. And that's because there was in the Ural Mountains, there was a facility called Mayak, where they were processing plutonium. And what they would do is they would just dump waste and, material into Lake Karachay. It was the closest one. It was small, and they would just dump into it. And so there was a buildup of radioactive sediment at the bottom and along the shore. So they used to say that, like, if you would stand next to this lake for more than 10 minutes, it could be a deadly dose of radiation. And this one was my favorite one to illustrate. I loved illustrating it, but it's kind of it's a little bit of a tricky one to illustrate because there's not actually a lot of images of this plant. I mean, the USSR is notorious for kind of keeping a lock on as much information as they can. And so I was doing my best to make a realistic image of what this might have looked like. but it's difficult because there's not a lot of pictures. So at the Mayak plant in the USSR and in this area, there was something called the Kishim disaster, which was in 1957. And this is when a storage tank filled with radioactive liquid waste exploded. And it was underground and it exploded out of the earth. And this is one of those things where we all know about Chernobyl, but we don't really know about the Kishim disaster. It was kind of kept under wraps, but this created like this huge, massive cloud of radioactive dust that was traveling across Eastern Europe and the USSR, and it contaminated thousands of miles. It was this really awful incident, but people just were not made aware of it because we were kind of more. This was in 1957. It predates Chernobyl. Interestingly enough, like this is Lake Karachay, kind of dramatically illustrated as a neon green, even though we all know that radiation isn't really neon green, but it's kind of a fun color to paint. In the 1980s, Lake Karachay was filled with concrete blocks, but then what ended up happening is it became this like hyper radioactive dry storage bed, and all of the wind would like whip up the sediment and kind of whip it into the air, and so it was like this really radioactive like you know dry nuclear waste storage facility. And so as a result, they filled it in with concrete and they just sealed it. And then for fun fact on top of that, it will it will be radioactive for 24,000 years. So that's kind of a fun fact as well. Lake Guatavita is in South America. It's in Colombia. And it was a fun lake to add into the book because it has to do with the Muisca people, which were the origins of our modern day fantasy of El Dorado. You've heard about El Dorado? We think of El Dorado. I loved painting El Dorado because we all love a fantasy. We all love this idea of a golden city in the Amazon rainforest. And that's what I painted here. This is kind of what Europeans and conquistadors, they thought that they were looking for. There was this legend, this urban myth of this gold city, right? But in fact, what was happening is there was a chieftain, a golden chieftain. He would cover himself in gold and he would float out to the middle of Lake Guatavita, and he was El Dorado, which meant the gilded one. That was his name. The chieftain was El Dorado. And he would throw gold into the lake before throwing himself into the lake as kind of this dedication to their gods. This was a bit of a hard thing to illustrate because there's not really any pictures of the golden chieftain. There's a few images that from more modern day, but it was really hard to determine what the appropriate thing to paint was. So I did my best. As an art historian, I loved researching Muisca gold specifically. The one thing about Muisca gold was it was all hammered flat. So you can kind of see here in the illustration that all of these pieces are flat. Nothing was formed into this three-dimensional way. Instead, it was kind of all pretty flat. And this is Lake Guatavita today. I didn't include an image, and I didn't really finish the story very well. But what happened was because of this legend of this gold inside of the lake, all of the Europeans were like desperately searching for it. And when they discovered that it was all connected to the Muisca people, there's all these periods in history where they were desperately trying to get the gold at the bottom of the lake. They pictured it as this like massive amounts of gold, right? So they would the first thing they did was they used a bucket chain where they just carried buckets of water to try to drain the lake. Did not work very well. They did not find very much gold. And then later on, they actually cut into the side of the lake. You can see it here. They cut into the side of it to try to drain it. And this was successful. But then what happened was the mud at the bottom of the lake congealed into this hard, like concrete like surface. And they couldn't dig it up very easily. So they gave up and just assumed there was really not that much gold. And then Colombia made it a sacred location. So it's not, nobody can look for gold anymore, but it's kind of satisfying because there actually is probably a lot of gold at the bottom of this lake. Maybe just not as much as the conquistadors imagined when they imagined El Dorado. I know I only have about 5 minutes left before we're gonna take some questions. I'm just gonna kind of go through these ones a little quickly. They're just fun just to talk about. The shaft is this huge sinkhole beneath a cow field in Australia that divers explored and died in because it was so labyrinthine and they never discovered the extent of it. So it's kind of a fun underground lake. Another one is Mount Nyiragongo, which is a lake of lava in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's the only permanent lava lake on the planet that's so liquidy that if you were to fall into it, you would just sink to the bottom. Like, you know, Gollum in The Lord of the Rings? Actually, that would not happen on any lake on Earth or any lava volcano on Earth. No lava in the world would you sink into the way Gollum does, except for Mount Nyiragongo. The rest of them, you would just lay on the top and just burn. So that's a fun fact. Spirit Lake in Washington is, of course, the result of Mount St. Helens. And it's kind of a fun thing to illustrate because it's kind of it's a very iconic eruption in US history. And it's really spooky. I actually went to visit it with my dad. And I was going to show you a couple pictures of that here. This is what it looks like in real life. And me and my dad went there, and it's like completely covered in these enormous, like gigantic tree stumps. And it's hard to appreciate here, but you can see that this is all tree stumps, and you can see them all over here as well. There's tens of thousands of them. And the location is really spooky and quiet and eerie. This is Mount St. Helens in the background. So I love that lake. Cenotes in Mexico are really spooky. They used to be the source of water for the Maya people. And they were really important to their religion and to their identity. But they also used to throw people into them. So it's kind of they had an interesting relationship with them. And of course, they're like this intricate Mave system at the bottom. If you've been to Yellowstone, then you know that it's really spooky, and all of the there's some 10,000 hydrothermal features on the surface of Yellowstone that are all boiling hot and potentially acidic. And if you do fall into an acidic pool in Yellowstone, then you could dissolve within hours because of the combined heat and acidity, as we've discovered many people have done before. Lake Vostok I should have put this one earlier because I love talking about it. It's 2 miles under the continental ice sheet in Antarctica. It's the size of Lake Ontario. It's humongous. And it's not frozen, it's liquid beneath 2 miles of ice, which is kind of amazing. And the Russians, it's always the Russians. They have control over it. They like have their base above it, and they've been researching it since the early, I can't remember, 50s. And they took the longest ice core ever from the ice above Lake Vostok to get to the bottom of it. It was 11,000 feet to take this ice sample to get to the bottom. Fun fact, they never actually were able to like access it very easily because of the pressure that's being placed on it. So it's still it's still happening. The last one is, in my mind, the spookiest of all lakes. So if you're not familiar with Lake Nyos, in my mind, this is the ultimate spooky lake, which is why it got kind of a more dramatic image, partly because it was fun and partly because it's very hard to show carbon dioxide. So Lake Nyos is the result of a limnic eruption, which means that at the bottom of this 600-foot lake, all of this carbon dioxide gas had built up. And suddenly it exploded, or it erupted, which meant that all of this carbon dioxide gas exploded out of this lake. And because it's heavier than the surrounding air, the gas is, it flowed down the side of the volcano into the village surrounding the lake and just killed everybody. So I think 1,800 people died, and all of their pets, all of their livestock, all the birds that were potentially close enough to the hovering cloud of carbon dioxide gas, and all the insects. So when people showed up, they had no idea what had happened because by the time they got there, it had dissipated and all that was left behind was death. So it's kind of, in my mind, the ultimate spooky lake because it just did this all by itself. You know, the humans they didn't even know that it could do something like this. So it happened one other time at Lake Manoon in 1984, and then it could potentially happen at Lake Kivu out in the Dominican Republic in Rwanda near the city of Goma. That, lake is potentially susceptible to also exploding. So there's a picture of it. Kind of fun. And then lastly, I think the last image of the slideshow is actually just showing you that there's 111 ghosts in the book, if you're curious about finding all the little ghosties throughout the book. So yeah, I think I did okay. Left exactly, look at that, 6:50. Perfect timing.
Yeah.
Or 7:50 for you guys, 6:50 for me here in
Yeah.
Wisconsin.
Perfect. Well, there haven't been any questions coming in, so I think you've just been nailing the presentation and super interesting. But if anybody has anything that they want to type in, now is the time to do it. We have about 9 minutes left before we say goodbye. And if there's anything else you want to touch on while we wait to see if anyone has any questions, go for it. And if not, we can wrap up a little bit early, I suppose.
Yeah. I don't know. It's fun. Spooky lakes are really fun. And there's a lot of topics I didn't talk about that kind of made the cut for the book that I think are interesting. So the book is available at like Barnes and Noble or at your local bookstore. A lot of local bookstores do carry it. It's a good kit. It's like technically a nonfiction middle school grade book. So a little bit of heavier topics in it, like the Lake Nyos and like old Whitey. All the kids are scared of old Whitey. But it's definitely like kind of in between age groups.
Our president, Andrea Lamoureux, has a copy that we've been passing around the office in preparation for tonight's webinar. So it's very fun.
Perfect. Somebody said, what was the lake under Antarctica? How was the lake under Antarctica discovered? So it was actually discovered because the surface above it was perfectly flat. So there was like all of these like, bumps and so on. So when the Russians came across that, they were like, this is kind of weird. And then they used radar to be able to tell that there was this huge body of water underneath the surface. There's actually a ton of under lakes that are kind of perpetually kept in isolation 2 miles below the ice in Antarctica, but none are as large as Lake Vostok. So, what lake in the UP of Michigan, other than the Superior, is really cool? I'm definitely like a little bit biased towards my giant lakes of the world. I've been to the Upper Peninsula, but I don't know if I know any other lakes off the top of my head that are in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that are really cool. Maybe Lake Kitchikippi, Lake Kitchikippi. I'm going to say that wrong. It's like a spring, and it's pretty cool. If you ever go up there, you should go check it out. It's like this very strange spring where you can see the water percolating up from the sand, and there's all these fish that are everywhere. So yeah, it's kind of fun. I have not been to New Hampshire. I have been to New England. I recently went to visit the Potomac River because there's some interesting spooky stuff there that I wanted to see. I do find myself now basing all of my vacation off of how can I get to the closest lake. And I didn't think I would be like that, but I got so excited. I went to Utah recently and I got so excited about Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And I was like, man, I feel like a crazy fangirl. And then my dad's going to Rwanda. Well, actually, maybe he's not now because Rwanda's like in a conflict with the Dominican Republic of Congo. But we were going to go to Rwanda and I was really excited about going to Lake Kivu. I was like, how do we get to Lake Kivu? It's going to explode one day. Hopefully it will not. There's actually preventative measures in place to prevent that from happening. And there's millions of people that live along the shores. So hopefully that does not happen, but I would really love to visit it. So anyway, thank you for having me tonight.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for joining us. We were all very much looking forward to this and it was fascinating. And I love your art. And I also appreciate seeing the process of where you started to where you finished. So thank you for including that.
No problem. Yeah, I have not been to every lake in the book just for Sandy. I visited a few of them just for the sake of marketing, but not all of them. Haven't even been to Yellowstone yet, so I'm really missing out. Got to learn how to melt in a pool of acid, you know?
It is, you feel like you're walking on the surface of the moon or some weird planet when you go there. It's very
Yeah,
strange.
yeah. Perfect. All right, well, I hope you guys have a wonderful night.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thank you. And thank you for all your nice comments. I saw them. So, all right, good night.
Bye.
Thank you.